Thank you so much. So this is the first time I've been invited by, if I've got this right, a theory group. That typically doesn't happen. Now, and the talk will either work or not work. It's kind of, the book was geared toward and focused on an imaginary international relations audience. Unfortunately, international relations scholars hardly ever invite me too. So, and we'll see why in a minute maybe, but so the goal is to give you the streamlined version of the book. Then you don't have to read it. You don't even have to do the first chapter, last chapter thing. But here's the deal. I set the bar really high. And the first, well, actually, and let me say one more thing. So unless you've done theory at Johns Hopkins or Minnesota, it's quite unlikely that you've encountered international relations work in your at least graduate training. So I'm depending on those of you who have not done it as a graduate student. I'm hoping against hope you remember it from your undergraduate years, okay? And it'll all work fine, because it hasn't, the history of the field hasn't gotten much better than what they told you when you were undergraduates. So bar set really high, first line of the book. In the first decades of the 20th century, in the United States, international relations meant race relations. Okay, now, you don't have to be a card-carrying member of the American Political Science Association or ISA to think, wait a minute, the irreducible core of international relations is the focus on the relations among states, right? Stole this from a textbook. The fundamental unit of analysis, we like to say, stole this from someone's lectures. Okay. Now you go almost anywhere else on campus or in the course catalogs, but an IR program or department, if what you're interested in is in race relations, right? That said, the reality is that for the professors writing the textbooks in the 1900s, 1910s, 1920s, 1930s, and yes, there were IR textbooks called that back then. I'm not being anachronistic. The units and the boundaries that mattered were, as they imagined back then, biological ones. Okay? IR was concerned with relations across what W.E.B. Du Bois called the global color line. Now I'm going to put up a slide, and if Du Bois means anything to you, you can already fill in what the slide is going to say, right? The prophetic utterance is how we understand it now, right? So Du Bois said it was the problem of the 20th century. Now, this actually might matter to theorists in some sense, because a century or more later, we read this quote, and we tend to treat Du Bois as a visionary who was pointing theory in a direction that had yet to gain much traction, right? So grappling with the color line idea would thus seem long overdue, and I've read many texts that have made this claim. But in fact, back then, the argument from one of the future editors of the country's first Journal of International Relations hardly represented the dissident edge of American social scientific thought. Okay? Rather, it's the premise from which the contending perspectives on the best means to preserve or advance Caucasian hegemony began. And there is always three perspectives, okay? It's Du Bois's heretical prescription for freedom now rather than later or never, to count the biological racists and the liberals, that distinguishes him and the thinkers that he influenced from the preferences of the discipline's otherwise divided group of great white fathers. So now, if all that's a surprise, generally the cognitive dissonance is greater the more one is invested or identifies with or as a specialist in IR. Certainly, so I'm just confessing here, certainly that was true for me back in the 1990s when I first started wrestling with the evidence. So for example, it's conventional now for decades to argue that the first IR journal in the United States is Foreign Affairs. But as I learned by exploring the stacks of the once great Clark University, which kind of started to go downhill about 1914 in Worcester, and I was there in the 1990s, so I still had the books from that period, and it was a great library, except when they were throwing the books away. The first journal of IR in the United States was called the Journal of Race Development, which two star faculty at Clark had begun to publish over a decade earlier. In 1910, Du Bois was on the editorial board of the journal. Du Bois's essay, Souls of White Folk, I'm expressing opinion here, the single best piece in his 1920 book, Darkwater, first appeared in the Journal of Race Development in 1917. Now, in that article, if you don't know it, you find this path-breaking analysis of the Great War, his explication of the role racism plays in imperialism, and the prediction of the coming fight for freedom across the colonies and semi-colonies of Asia and Africa. Now, the Journal of Race Development changed its name to the Journal of International Relations in 1919, and the first research I did on this project was to trace the story of the sale of the old journal to a new set of owners, the Council on Foreign Relations, which relaunched it with the new and the owners hope punchier title, Foreign Affairs. Okay? So, two more equally formidable hurdles, at least if you're for disciplinary insiders. Here's the first. It was the problem of empire or imperialism, sometimes referred to as race subjection, that preoccupied the first self-identified professors of international relations. Race subjection or imperialism, together with a phenomenon that they saw going hand in hand with it, which was race war. Right? Most important book of the early 20th century by a scholar of, by someone who was trained at Harvard, anyway, it doesn't really matter. Carrie Coolidge, but you don't care about that. So most basically, just to cut to the chase, IR was a discipline dedicated to theorizing how best to preserve and extend white hegemony or white supremacy, or what we now call hegemony, against those struggling to end their subjection. Now, that discovery upends the contemporary discipline's exceptionalism. It's very hard to get an image of exceptionalism, but this is mine. Together with its account of the course of the United States in the world. That is, as if we learned to insist during the Cold War, America is not and never was an empire, the IR professors argue that the discipline itself had never showed much interest in the study of imperialism. This is the premise or conceit that drives Michael Doyle's 1988 putative path-breaking book, Empires. Just to quote him from the first page, imperialism was not in the mainstream of scholarly literature on world politics in 1940, he insists. Okay? So now the third and final hurdle in the way of our understanding. The ancestors who were wrestling with the prospects of race war and imperialism that imperialism had brought about, identified the epicenter of the global biological threat in the 3 square miles or so at the northern end of Manhattan, known as Harlem. Right? Once the northern migration of African Americans took off in the early 1910s, Harlem came to exemplify the threat to white supremacy posed by backward independent peoples across the globe. Right? Now, Harlem is the same place that one of the heretofore unrecognized IR theorists of the age, Alain Locke, called the largest black metropolis in the world. Just to quote him, the advance guard of the African peoples in their contact with 20th century civilization, the home of the Negro Zionism, and as in India, in China, in Egypt, in Ireland, Russia, Bohemia, Palestine, and that's Jewish Palestine, and Mexico, the center of a people's resurgence and pursuit of self-determination. Now, needless to say, Harlem has no standing in contemporary understandings of international relations, okay? More to the point, okay, that's a conceit, but more to the point, nor do the scholars like Locke associated with the then self-identified New Negro movement. The key figures all taught at Howard University in Washington, D.C. That's the Mecca, is how Ta-Nehisi Coates and many people before and after Ta-Nehisi Coates will describe that place as he does. It's my favorite part of In Between the World and Me, right? When he gets to Howard for the first time and he realizes this world is much bigger than he imagined from Baltimore, right? So think about it, it's 250-acre campus in the northwest sector of the nation's capital. Its faculty all Harvard and Chicago trained. What I call in the book the Howard School of IR Theory, and I'm cheating because it's not all these guys, but they're most of them. This was, I argue, the rival of any IR faculty in the country in that era. Columbia, Harvard, Chicago, better than Princeton by a long shot, and no other institution was even in the running by the time of World War II. And then you always have to have a debate when you're teaching at Wisconsin. You have to say, okay, no, Wisconsin wasn't it. I'm going to tell you UVA was not it at the time. Okay, that said, so if you accept that argument, that said, the Howard School remains terra incognita in all accounts of the discipline of international relations in the United States until now. Now, keep in mind, I mean, there's some explanations for that, right? Keep in mind that most histories of most disciplines are produced by insiders, okay? Practitioners. That's a problem. The intellectual historian, one of my heroes, Bruce Kuklick, calls the genre, in fact, practitioner histories, okay? They're usually very weak sociologically. That is, they rarely deal with institutions of English departments, say, or of history professional associations and so on. Practitioner histories virtually never consult archives of professors' papers or of those of departments and of the foundations that fund them. That's true even of the histories of the history profession, which is why Peter Novick's book was so provocative when it came out, because he actually read professors' papers like for the first time, okay? Now, so instead, insiders typically tell the history of the discipline in question as a set of insights from the past that achieve their highest expression in the works of the leading lights of the present, right? These are the stories handed down in the syllabi to graduate students, so you're learning them, and the watered down versions you all tell to the undergraduates in their intro courses. In other words, not to put too fine a point on it, origin myths, okay, myths of origins. So in IR in the US we learn, and I used to teach this, okay, I don't know where I learned it from, but I used to teach it that the Greek historian Thucydides is the first realist. Undergraduates are even likely to learn a little bit of the Melian dialogue, right? The strong do what they will, the weak suffer what they must. I'm sure some of you have taught this in a section somewhere or got taught it yourselves. And then what happens? Then comes Machiavelli and Grotius and Kant. Okay? And then there's this roughly 100-year-long dark age in history, okay? From the late 1800s to about the 1940s or so, unless you throw Woodrow Wilson in there really quickly, before things to start picking up again. There's the University of Chicago that claims it's the first program in international relations, okay? So now here's the funny thing about that 100-year-long dark age. It's the time when the first departments, real chairs, real journals, real professional associations, institutes, and so on were being founded. All the professors today have to say about those key decades is that when it was a debate, it is when a debate is allegedly launched between something they call realism and something else they call idealism. Although it turns out that no such debate ever took place. That is, it is what we call a social fact that IR professors today believe and repeat. So the debate never happened, but the belief in the debate is real, okay? The debate was not real, but the belief in the debate is real, and it gets taught. The good news is, that you won't get a job if you follow this good news, is that it means the space is wide open for investigation, right? And the puzzle I try to solve, because political scientists today speak that language of puzzle solving, is posed most powerfully by Toni Morrison in her essay, Unspeakable Things Unspoken. To quote her, I love this essay so much. Certain absences are so stressed, so ornate, so planned, that they call attention to themselves. What intellectual feats had to be performed by the author or his critics to erase me from a society seething with my presence? And what effect has that performance had on the work? What are the strategies of escape from knowledge, of willful oblivion? So a key task of the book, I thought, is to call attention to the Howard School's contributions to theory, in particular these thinkers' early and relentless critiques of the supposed truths of racial science and the role racism played in sustaining imperialism. Okay? But then I do something else. And so I also tell the story of their failed efforts to break through the color line that leading whites in the discipline seemed so intent on upholding. So here are these set of scholars, right? And there was a project to keep them out of the discipline in some sense. Okay, so keep something in mind about the era. yes, African Americans might earn PhDs at Harvard, and then we celebrate, that Du Bois was the first PhD, et cetera, black PhD. And what that did for folks at the time in the 10s and 20s, it allegedly or putatively illustrated the validity of the laws of race development that IR professors advance. Okay. Yes, a guy like Du Bois demonstrated that there was hope for the race in the very, very, very long, distant future. Okay. At the same time, though, they were denied any role in the white profession and university system, and they were instead forced to create their own journals and associations. One of the great, right here. None of these institutions and publications has been acknowledged in any history of international relations until now. So say you want to, you can imagine this project as only a political scientist would imagine it. I want to see what black people wrote for international relations. I'll check the APSR, even though it was a third-rate journal when it came out, and I'll check, whatever other foreign affairs. And you would find out that it's just Du Bois in Foreign Affairs, never in the no black in American Political Science Association. So you conclude they clearly had nothing to say about international relations. But you have to read Phylon. Or the Journal of Negro Education, which I said was a key journal of international affairs, development, politics, right? These are where the ideas are, right? Now, oh, and I'm going to guess the same thing happens in political theory. But what do I know? So in 1963, John Hope Franklin, who taught alongside the Howard School theorists during the first part of his career, when he was still a young scholar, described the reality of the conditions under which he and his more senior colleagues still labored within the white academy. So this is John Hope Franklin in 63, right before he gets his job, moves from Howard to Brooklyn College, and from there, the world opens up to him. He says, when remembered at all, the scholar is all too often, he's all too often an afterthought. When his work is recognized, it's usually pointed as the work of a Negro. Such recognition is as much the product of the racist mentality as the Negro restrooms in the Montgomery airport are. Okay? So, contributions to theory, a story about the actual efforts to engage scholars in the constant rebuffing of this process. But there's a hopeful side to this if you want. So the third thing I try to do is trace the strong connections the Howard School thinkers forged to black thinkers and movements in London and Paris. This is Du Bois at the Pan-African Congress, for instance, okay? Now, and those connections are with the future leaders of independent Africa and the island nations of the Caribbean. It's very hard to find a white IR scholar from this period, the 20s and 30s, who had any IR scholar, I'll say. There was a couple, anthropologists, etc., but for political scientists, IR guys had virtually no connection to these worlds that these heirs of Du Bois did, okay? So, and I call these the counter networks to the white internationalists in London, Paris, Geneva, and so forth, with which all our newest histories of internationalism, cosmopolitanism, and globalism are concerned. So let me start with Alain Locke, he was the real revelation for me after starting this project. Locke completed his PhD at Harvard in 1918. Born in Philadelphia, he's an intellectual powerhouse. He wins a Rhodes Scholarship to Oxford in 1907, the first and only black awardee for another 56 years. And he was the first of the thinkers to arrive at Howard University. Now, if you know Locke at all, if you've taken courses in Afro-American history or literature, etc., then you know him, right, for his role in the 1925 New Negro issue of the Survey Graphic, and then an anthology that comes out soon after. If you've never looked at this magazine or the book, I'd recommend that you do it. Du Bois is at the end of it. But it turns out, I think it's more significant ultimately, Locke turns out to be the first scholar, as far as I've been able to determine, to reject the era's social science theories of race. He calls them, and I'm going to be explicit about this, he calls them a pseudoscience. Okay? And the reason I'm doing that is because the great Omar Bartov, who has actually written a history of the retreat of scientific racism, says it's totally anachronistic to use the word pseudoscience in this period. No one did. It was accepted until, the 40s or 50s when you get UNESCO and so forth. This is just wrong. Sorry, I said Omar Bartov. It's Elizar Barkin that does that. Okay? Now, where does he do this? He does it in these amazing Howard University International Relations lectures of 1915, which he was then asked to repeat in 1916. And all this was a consolation because the white administrators of Howard University thought it was too controversial for Locke to actually teach a course on the problem of international relations in that period, right? And he's also then the first, so what is race if it's a pseudoscience? He says the race is a useful ethnic fiction. Okay. He was also, and this is, you need people like this, he's also the Howard School tireless publisher and networker. So he didn't necessarily complete all his projects because he had about 420 of them going on at any one time. Building museums, art collections, supporting foundations and so forth, commuting from Harlem to Washington and then to Africa and so forth, okay? So for example, he was the inspiration behind Ralph Bunche's forgotten book, A Worldview of Race. And I'm sorry, there's a bad image, but it's this is my copy of this book. It's part of Locke's famous bronze booklet series. I write about it extensively in the book, so you can learn more about it. But here's the thing. Well, I'll tell you about this thing. So, A Worldview of Race, Ralph Bunche. Bunche was North America's first black political scientist, an independent Marxist, and for a while, I believe, a closeted communist, but his biographers insist, no, no, no. We can talk about that. Bunche is hired to build up their political science department in 1928. A year after this picture is taken, a year after he graduated from UCLA with a BA. He completes his Harvard PhD in 1934. Most famously, he wins the Nobel Prize for his work at the UN during the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. I just spoke at what is that program called for the American political? Is it the Du Bois program? No, it's the Ralph Bunche. So there's a Ralph Bunche program at the American Political Science Association, right? And I just spoke at a fundraiser for it last year. And I said, it would be kind of good to maybe publish Bunche, at least posthumously, in the American Political Science Review, because he was, I would argue, the only president of the American Political Science Review who's never had his works reviewed in that magazine or published anything in it. But you can find Bunche writing all the time in Journal of Negro Education, etc. But be it as it may, he had a close comrade on the faculty, I did that on purpose. This is E. Franklin Frazier. His PhD is from Chicago in 1931. Frazier studied at Clark and did pioneering work on the black bourgeoisie. Now, Bunche and Frazier clashed off and on with the Pan-Africanist protege of Du Bois, Rayford Logan, PhD, Harvard, 1936. Locke actually tries to hire him to start an African Studies Center at Howard in the 1920s. Now, I want you to think about that because, of course, our first African Studies Centers come in the 1950s, right? But Locke fails to obtain funding for that project. It's just really at the beginning of the Depression. So Logan only joins the history department 10 years later in 1938. Logan was Du Bois's translator at the Pan-African congresses when he was basically doing arbitrage to survive in Paris in those years in the early 1920s. Now, Bunche, Frazier, and Locke bring the Trinidad-born Eric Williams, whose DPhil is from Oxford, 1938, to Howard's political science department. He took over Bunche's classes when Bunche moved over to the OSS and the State Department in the middle of World War II. Now Williams is undoubtedly the best known of these scholars that I'm talking about for his study that upended moralist explanations for the end of the slave trade. It's still debated, it's still refuted every two decades by economists at conferences at Bellagio and so forth. But people are still reading this book, right? And now Williams, right, goes on. He's only at Howard for a short time because he goes on to become a prime minister of Trinidad and Tobago. And then finally, the last person I just want to note to you briefly is that Rayford Logan himself invites the Michigan-born Mers Tate, PhD, Radcliffe, 1941, the first black woman to receive a doctorate in international relations in the United States. He invites her to join the history department That is after Williams and Bunch opposed her hire in political science, since she was, of course, a woman. Okay, she wrote on arms control in the first part of her career, and the only positive comment I got in the manuscript review by Bob Jervis for this book, but luckily I had multiple presses like looking at it. Jervis said, "Hey, I cited Merz Tate in my own work on arms control," so he was happy about that. But Tate moved out of arms control to study the course of imperialism in the Pacific. And as I described in my book, it's a kind of tragedy. She has 6 manuscripts in her archives, none ever published, 2 on Africa, 2 on imperialism or sub-imperialisms in the Pacific, and 1 a novel about the end of the monarchy in Hawaii, among many other texts. But that's the situation. So for 20 years or so, I argue Howard's thinkers carved out a unique niche for themselves in a still deeply segregated and unequal discipline, not least because the white IR departments and programs, if I can call them that, operated with modest outside funding at best, most of which dried up in the Depression years. I mean, the only department that had any money at all, and they still have that money, was Harvard. And the Harvard money in international studies is what helps subsidize the publication of Merz Tate's arms control books out of Radcliffe at the time. So what happens to the Howard School? There's just like 20 years if you want, right? I wish I could end this talk on an upbeat note, but I'm obligated to take you where the evidence leads. And I think 3 things conspire to doom the Howard School in the Cold War. And this is my image of the Cold War. One is McCarthyism and the campaign by the FBI against black thinkers and institutions as the civil rights movement gained steam. I cannot tell you how much of an impact the loyalty hearings had on the Howard faculty. It's revealed in their private papers. It's revealed in the public history. Logan talks about it in the history of Howard University. These guys didn't trust one another. They all thought they were under investigation all the time. Most of them were. Bunch was warning his colleagues because he was in the government at the time, but he was also coming under very intense scrutiny as well. So much so that Tate at some point, we have this quote, is she's afraid to use the word imperialism in her study of the Pacific. And so she's going to talk about, well, it's the word that historians have used from that moment on. America is not imperialistic. America has policies of expansion. And that's what she uses, okay? So there's that. A second factor was the tremendous expansion of foundation support for IR. This is my alma mater, so I have to put these guys up here. Right, and especially, right, not just international studies centers, because actually the IR professors were kind of grumpy about not getting very much of the money in the first decades of the Cold War, because the money was really going to the area studies centers, right, after World War II. Now, the historically black colleges and universities were passed over completely in the building of African studies centers around the country, as I document in the book, as has long been recognized, even though everyone admitted that it was Howard, Roosevelt University, and Lincoln that really had pioneered the study of Africa when white universities had no expertise or interest in the subject. So this is a famous African Studies Center, right? It should have been at Harvard, but Harvard said, with the promise of 10 years of funding for an African Studies Center, said absolutely not interested in this field, and turned down the money. The money went to BU instead, and then to Northwestern, where Melville Herskowitz is. Okay, so Howard is passed over for funding, and I try to document that to the extent that I can, and it's pretty clear, okay? So the third factor, though, is the Supreme Court decision in Brown v. Board and its promise, that's the Ford Foundation, there's Brown v. Board, and its promise to end America's academic apartheid, okay? So by that time, 54, Bunch and Eric Williams are gone. Bunch left, stopped lecturing at Howard in 1950, claimed he had a offer from, he probably did, had an offer from Harvard that he never actually accepted, but never went into a classroom again. As I said, Eric Williams was involved in post-colonial politics. Alain Locke dies in 1955. Those hired just before or during the war carry on in an atmosphere of increasing acrimony and bitterness over the lack of resources and especially research support as this is expanding in the Cold War university system generally, right? So depending on their age, discipline, and professional networks, one might harbor, and now here I'm quoting a Logan protege. He's now an old man himself, but he was a young scholar, and he took care of Logan in his declining years. This is Michael Winston, right? And he describes this, he says, so depending on who you were at this time, as Howard's like kind of resource base is declining, depending on who you were, you could harbor the almost impossible dream of joining a white department as its token minority. The Howard group grows increasingly alienated, similar to other black intellectuals at the time, not least due to the precarious positions they occupied in what Winston calls the intellectual periphery, where he says even just the token desegregation of the 50s and 60s proved sufficient to erode the small but productive clusters of research scholars together with the journals and departments they had built. And what I was able to kind of pull out of the Howard archives and the archives at the Library of Congress sustains that image as well. Now, by the 1950s too, IR's now familiar realist catechism was coming into being with the mythical as opposed to real or better institutional story, origin story I've sketched here. Now, as part of that process, the imperial and racial dimensions are being made to disappear in the textbooks and in the graduate courses, etc. Now, unfortunately, though, what also is made to disappear is the works of Du Bois, Bunch, Locke, and Tate. Okay, keep in mind that as I show in the book, right, and so as this is going on, so in other words, for decades, IR is over-concerned with the question of racism, the threats to white supremacy, the threats to white hegemony. It's going to still be there in the popular consciousness post the 1950s. But IR turns away from that, okay? But here's the funny thing, okay? That's a moment when I argue that racism is growing more, not less visible in world politics. So IR stops talking about racism as racism comes to dominate world politics. How do we know that? Count the number of UN resolutions in any particular year, as Paul Gordon Loren has done in Power and Prejudice. He says no subject was the topic of more resolutions in the General Assembly than issues of apartheid, racism, anti-colonialism, and so forth. But the discipline has virtually nothing to say about that, about these problems at that moment. Okay. One could, as I said, one could count resolutions in the UN General Assembly, but I'll give you another example. You can do this and you can do it really cheaply. You don't need a data set to do that. You can read the works of Harold Isaacs, and I'm sorry, it's very, very hard to find a picture of Harold Isaacs. Isaacs was a journalist, one time a comrade of Leon Trotsky, who improbably was named a professor of political science at MIT's Center for International Studies. When I discovered all this about Isaacs, I wrote to the remaining faculty members and said, did you know, Isaacs knew Trotsky and Trotsky wrote the, introduction to his first book? Oh, and he helped smuggle Ho Chi Minh and he was a Trotskyist for a long time. No one knew anything about this guy. He was just the ghost I remember him, he was this ghost in my department as a young graduate student. I just told Robert Fatton that I'm like that ghost now. No one really knows who I am. I'm just wandering around and doing stuff. But anyway, you could read his book. He was the only, right? He's at MIT Center for International Studies. He's an amazing author. You can read Scratches on Our Minds if you're an Asianist. That book still gets cited. This book, The New World of Negro Americans, The Impact of World Affairs on the Race Problem in the United States, and particularly on the Negro, his view of himself, his country, and of Africa, was never reviewed in any political science journal in this country, even though it wins I'm going to get the name of this world wrong. It wins an award, the awards are still possible, for best book on race relations in the United States. I can't remember. remember it, sorry. But so the book was very visible in the world at large, invisible in political science, right? And what I argue is he was virtually alone then in writing about what he calls the breakdown of the worldwide system of white supremacy. Okay, so this book, this research project is quite interesting. It had as its goal to see if African Americans were likely to revolt as Africa was gaining its independence. And he concluded, no, we were safe. Okay, but so that was the issue. So just as the last thing I want to talk about, and to illustrate my point, okay, let's consider the reputational curve of Du Bois's two explosive essay collections, right? Souls of Black Folk and Dark Water. I already showed you a slide of Dark Water. I'm not going to produce it again. This book, now routinely considered one of the greatest books of the 20th century. They were read, referenced, and treated as essential sources for international relations when they first appeared. But for decades after World War II, the only citation to them appear almost exclusively in Philon and the Journal of Negro Education, the two main outlets for African Americans in the segregated university system. So the subsequent canonization as essential works of history, criticism in diasporic theory, I mean, how does that happen? Isaacs went to the librarian at MIT at some point late in the 50s when he was writing this book. He said, can I have these? He wanted to take home Souls of Black Folk and Dark Water because no one had checked it out. For 20 years, basically. And he thought he was going to get to have this, right? So this is like the kind of disjunction that occurs. So how does it become this, work of genius, right? Well, together with the restoration of his place in the history of 20th century political thought, how does that happen? Well, the short answer would be, these are the outcomes of the Black Power movement's rise on Americans' campuses. Without that, we don't get this, right? So now, for a long time, I ended this talk by noting how the discipline of IR in the United States remained almost completely insulated from the Black Studies revolution, and I try to document that to the extent that I can. And so, to note one consequence, its leading big-name thinkers look nearly exactly the same as they did in 1970, and I like to show slides, and my colleagues laugh, but the graduate students have a hard time recognizing Jim Fearon, Alex Wendt, Bob Cohane, Joe Nye, Ken Waltz, however that list goes. But I think in the events of the past year, right, I decided that there are some more important observations to make. Kind of like this slide. One is that the ideas of the leading intellectuals and popularizers of racism in public life are all too familiar from the discipline's earliest days. The ideas are virtually the same. Okay. Well, we know this guy. We know this idea, this concept, for instance, of white genocide, okay? I can't remember what my slides do at this point. Or Muslim bans, which T. Lothrop Stoddard wrote about in the 1920s, the New World of Islam. Anyway, so that's one thing. Two, so that's point two, it's shameful how those who have been writing about racism and hierarchy in contemporary world politics in the past 10 years are still ignored, unread, uncited, and untaught in the graduate field seminars and syllabi across the United States, when the truth is they ought to be the starting points for field seminars going forward. So here's just one person, Robbie Shilliam, for instance. I could give you more slides, but run out of time. But they're just not read, not cited. You just have to, you can test this yourself. Look at your field seminars, okay? The syllabi for your field seminars. My third and final point is that we have to recognize how international relations professors themselves play and continue to play roles in what gets called the alt-right today, but what I call in the book the militant right in IR and security studies. So I'm going to tell you about this guy in a minute, right? So to see this, we have to come to grips with our failure to think hard enough about who and what constitutes this or any discipline. This is Henry Salvatore. If you're at Penn like me, you kind of know he's like a donor to a skating rink at Penn. But much more important, he was a fundamental donor to the militant right wing think tanks as the right wing starts to try to figure out, like we all now know it's this big, remarkable enterprise that gives us neoconservatives, but it was not true in the 50s and early 60s. And these guys are trying to sort out how to use their money to advance a project of militant anti-communism and so forth. And Henry Salvatore was one of the people funding these things, right? So we know, though, virtually, this is my point, we know virtually nothing about the individuals and foundations that built the institutions of the international militant right. And that's not my term. That term appears in International Studies Quarterly in 1967 or so to talk about certain right-wing cabals. And the right-wing cabals write back and say, this can't be true at all, okay? So, and this is the guy I'm thinking about. You know, Gorka teaches IR at the National Defense University, okay? So when I think about Gorka, I think about this man, second on the right, Stefan Pisoni, who I'm writing about right now. You haven't heard about it. You haven't heard about him at all. He was, you might know Robert Strauss-Hupé if you believe in geopolitics. Strauss-Hupé is seen as like one of the classic geopolitical thinkers of the 20th century. Well, Pisoni was Strauss-Hupé's idea man, basically. And Strauss-Hupé calls him the greatest strategist of the 20th century. But you don't know him at all. Mattered quite a lot in those years. He wrote this book, The Geography of Intellect, Nathaniel Whale and Stefan Pisoni. Its argument that there's a worldwide deficit in IQs. And the place where there are most people are the stupidest, and that's where the development aid is going. The places where we have to protect IQs from disintegration are being abandoned by, you know, the governments of the Kennedy and then Johnson administrations. These ideas are central part of what folks are talking about in the paper today. So I said, let's take Gorka. This is my last point. If he's like the thinkers I've been studying lately, Gorka gave up his membership in the associations we think matter, or else they never joined. That's what Pisoni did. I have his letter of resignation from, you know, a variety of institutes. The professional associations did not matter to most of these characters, right? But here's the thing, he's active in ones we hardly know exist. For instance, in this case, the Institute of World Politics. I never see people talking about that. They don't come to ISA. So are they the discipline or not? If you want to know where the racism in contemporary international relations theory is most pronounced, even if the discipline's leaders have nothing to say about it, then you have to look beyond the confines of the university seminars, our syllabi, and the professional meetings we attend, because there are other meetings that we don't attend and these folks do. So that's the argument. I can't remember. This is the last slide. Probably the book again. Yeah, okay. That's it. So thanks. Now, unfortunately, you can't. The book is written, so, you know. we have to do something else, but we can try.
Many people don't know. So Ahmadai, A-M-A-D-A-E.
I know him. Mm-hmm.
No,
sociologist.
Wrote a book called Rationalizing Capitalist Democracy about how Rand, out in Los Angeles, generated rational choice as a theoretical approach to displace Marxist approaches to politics and democracy. That's why I asked the question. So it's parallel to this Salvatore and parallel to
it's parallel to these last 2 pages, last 5 minutes.
Yeah.
But yeah.
That's all I can remember.
Oh, please.
Okay, thank you so much for your talk. I really enjoyed it. I have 2 questions. The first is whether, like, how somebody, like a figure like Arturo Schomburg would figure in the genealogy that you're tracing. And then the other one is just like how some of these scholars might have been influenced by, you know, not black, non-scholar intellectuals, by, you know, black international, like black involvement in communist internationalism, and, you know, were they reading the New York Worker or other publications like that?
Okay. So I did something, I did many, I took many shortcuts in the book. And one of the ones I decided to do was to avoid kind of talking about, if you want, black internationalism generally,
Yeah.
and I talked about 5 professors like at Howard. So the idea was to actually think about the discipline, qua discipline, as the discipline now understands themselves. So Schoenberg, of course, well, one, he was a benefactor to some of these folks. Locke knew him quite well, but actually everyone, everyone but Mer's tape, okay, and we can talk about her in a second, were immersed in the networks that, for lack of a better term, called, black internationalist networks, the Harlem Renaissance networks, etc. They, if you read Logan's unpublished memoirs and his journal at the Library of Congress, which he deposited there because he was convinced Howard University was going to destroy it, because he was a little paranoid by the end of his career, and Locke. They constantly traveled to the Hotel Theresa in Harlem. They stayed there, and that's where Locke's center of gravity was, because they said this was like this, utopia, right? Even though it's still Harlem or it's still New York, and sometimes they get basement rooms, because they said compared to Washington D.C., it was so oppressive to be there in a way. So they are networked there. They're networked abroad for sure. Bunch. Certainly, Logan certainly, Locke certainly engaged, fought with people like George Padmore. So Padmore would be a perfect example for you. I mean, he adopted the name Padmore. I mean, they knew him as Malcolm Nurse when he was a student at Howard, but he basically drops out because he's trying to organize the worldwide revolution, right? But all you have to do, you can read. I mean, Bunch used to have these cells. I mean, in his home, they would meet during the famous conferences of the 1930s. Bunch was clearly involved in, for lack of a better term, kind of dissident communist networks for a period. I found one of his journal articles. You can track the footnotes. So he's got this journal article called Communism and the Negro Question. And it's unpublished, supposedly. Bunch does. It was one of his first pieces. And you can find it in his archives. It's unpublished. His biographer, Paul Henry, do I have the right name? No. Charles Henry. Biographer Charles Henry published it in an anthology, right? But he never published it. And of course, it is a good thing he didn't, because, Bunch kept insisting he was never a communist, etc., doing all the loyalty hearings. This is a pretty, I don't know what he was doing with this piece, but I found it literally word for word, like in this, I just searched phrases online, and I found it in a kind of, how to best describe this? Like a dissident communist newspaper under the name Jim Cork. Okay, and then you try to find out who Jim Cork is. Some people believe it's someone else. No one's ever said it's Bunch. But the text, large segments of it are there with Bunch's original, I've seen the original document, etc. So Bunch was engaged with the left. I mean, if you read The World View of Race, right, sorry, I do geek out on this stuff, and it also solves not answering questions very well. So my colleague Adolph Reed, right? It's class, not race. Okay. Well, that was Bunch's line in The World View of Race. Bunch hated the idea of black identity. He didn't want to identify as one. He thought all this stuff just got to get in the way, as the book says, from the worldwide class war that we need to foment, basically, and that's the only thing that will help the Negro, both in Africa and in the United States, etc. So Bunch was certainly engaged. Fraser, for sure. They were. When Bunch goes on his 2-year fellowship to London and then to South Africa, that's where he meets people like Kwame Nkrumah for the first time, etc., and other kinds of intellectuals who would then go on, like Eric Williams and C.L.R. James. So they are definitely enmeshed in those networks. Please.
You ended your talk talking about the way these ideas get out into popular culture now, right? The tiki torch crowd. I'm aware of how the Howard intellectuals engaged with the black community, but on the white side, in the early period when you're talking about, how do these ideas get out into popular culture? And by that I'm thinking maybe Time Magazine or something like that.
Well, I describe this in the book, but since I can't compete with him, David Levering Lewis described it much better. Du Bois debated. Both Du Bois and Locke debated Stoddard multiple times in public, on the radio, and in Chicago at this place where it was basically a wrestling rink, a wrestling venue. But they had these major debates. I mean, these ideas were out there. Well, I think the book kind of says every white scholar believed these ideas about white supremacy. We want to believe now that it was. I say this something like, we think these ideas belong to like the white the poor people, folks in the South, etc. When it is what the professors themselves are teaching and writing about. So there are IR professors doing skull size measurements or making claims about, what the various skull sizes mean, etc. I mean, so the intellectual side of this also had, its popular commentators. Stoddard was one of them. Stoddard published in this. Stoddard was trained by a guy named Archibald Carey Coolidge. Archibald Carey Coolidge was a historian at Harvard, and when the Journal of Race Development becomes Foreign Affairs, Coolidge becomes its first editor. And this is really key, but then, Hamilton Fish Armstrong was his assistant, but people always associate the journal with Ham Armstrong. So Coolidge was a famous professor who wrote on imperialism, because again, everyone wrote on imperialism. And in his later years, people have tried to say, well, because Stoddard is remembered now, along with Madison Grant, right, as the two arch racists. And I say, there's so much known as the arch racists that they read, the war against whites, I can't remember what I call it, the rising tide of color, but they don't read his 16 other books in international relations that are reviewed in the American Political Science Association. And the reviewers constantly go, if you see the name Stoddard and worry, you don't have to this time, because this is a really good contribution to, the study of global monetary policy or whatever it is, whatever he was writing about. So these guys were tremendously popular writers, writing in the Saturday Evening Post. Madison Grant, was a patrician, a benefactor to lots of causes, etc. So much so that Coolidge said, we can't afford to publish Stoddard in Foreign Affairs because we offered such measly, recompense when he's making, tens of thousands of dollars for his stuff. So I believe it's out there, it's on the radio and so forth, but such that Du Bois and Locke could actually engage these folks.
I suppose a follow-up question. When you're talking about all these Harvard University intellectuals, many of them seem to have been trained in the same status quo department. So who are they learning from? So I'm curious, when you're talking about these folks upending race relations and upending, I'm curious.
Well, they were in part in rebellion against some of what they learned, but they were all trained, here. So one of the things, another thing I discovered in the book, and I talk about, but I didn't talk about it in this talk. So imagine you're at Harvard in 1927, and there were field exams. I've seen them, okay? And I have to tell you, they were like 8 days, 24 hours a day. It was like torture, right? Well, one of the fields you could specialize in was colonial administration. We don't understand. We never studied imperialism. We've never been interested in it, etc. But you could get a PhD in it, right? Colonial administration was a recognized field. I write about one of the most influential scholars of that moment is someone named Raymond Leslie Buell. And why I focus on him is he's virtually the only white scholar of international relations I could find who actually engaged with people like Logan and Bunch. He was a mentor to Bunch. He was a friend of Logan's. He was a patron of them, in part for pecuniary reasons or personal reasons. He needed introductions to Black Africa, where he went and wrote a 2-volume book called The Native Problem. The Native Problem in Africa. But he was a very big IR scholar at Harvard. He quits to run the Foreign Policy Association. Now, the Foreign Policy Association still exists. You don't think about it at all. But back in the day, it was much more important than the Council on Foreign Relations. When he quits, he's replaced by Rupert Emerson, who, in your text, probably like if you have a field seminar, I guess in comparative politics, it wouldn't be in IR. There might be recommended reading, 1 week down, 16th book, a 36th book, Rupert Emerson from Empire to Nations, famous book. Rupert Emerson was a specialist in colonial administration. He had taken Buell's position in colonial administration and trained a ton of people. You know, the leading lights that we know now, but Ralph Bunche as well, et cetera. So depending on where these folks were, you know, they trained under smart people, you know. So there's a much better book than mine. So if you only had to read one book, I'd read this one instead. It's I can't remember what it's called now. And now I'm really the guys at Northwestern, book on Du Bois.
Alden Morris?
Yeah, Alden Morris's book.
Scholar
What's it called?
Scholar Denied?
The Scholar Denied. You must read this book, right? Because he basically sort of says Du Bois started sociology in the United States. He's absolutely 100% correct about this, and how that history has to be willfully ignored. So one of the stories that exists to this day is Du Bois was influenced by Max Weber, because of course Max Weber started sociology in the United States, so I don't really understand, you know, it's Marx, Weber, and remember those weird genealogies that people create. So for sociology, it's Marx, Weber, and, you know, Veblen, or Toynbee, or whatever, Schumpeter, right? Weber actually depended on Du Bois, not the other way around, for his understandings about race relations in the U.S. South. And he called Du Bois the best sociologist, bar none, in the southern states of the United States. But, you know, sociology has told the story differently. So in Alden Morris's book, you'll also see a lot of the kind of intellectual connections, who they're studying with, but who they are competing with, and what work was done to undermine their contributions in a way. And I try to show that, you know, in the case of, you know, in the domain that I'm looking at, how that happened as well. So. Do I get to do this?
Yeah,
No,
you might
sorry,
as well,
sorry, no.
'cause I don't know
Okay.
everyone here, so
Please.
that's all.
I just have a question about the gender dynamics.
Mm-hmm.
To what extent, for example, is Kate marginalized by her male colleagues because of her gender?
To what extent?
Yeah.
She went to her grave insisting that she had been abused, cheated by the administration, by her colleagues. There was so much acrimony. I think it actually ruined her life. I mean, a colleague of mine at Penn is writing her biography, so we're going to know more once Barbara Savage is finished with this. But I worked in Kate's papers, but you know, unfortunately, when I was working them, there was this jumble of mass of documents, bills, her accounting statements, her manuscripts, etc. Barbara's got Howard University to actually start processing the papers, so they're in better order. She insisted that she was underpaid. She was treated as a harpy, as someone who was overly complaining about her work conditions, etc. I mean, I think she was basically just drunk. Logan was her longtime chair, and by the end of it, they hated one another so much. I can't figure out what was going on with it. That Logan. You know, she was once stabbed, Merce Tate was stabbed in a house robbery. And Logan said she made it up just to gain attention and like to, you know, be in the newspaper, etc. And she tried to have a blood drive, like she needed blood. And Logan refused to support this at Howard. So the Radcliffe Alumni Association came to her help, you know, and preserved her and protected her. But she had terrible life as a scholar. Might have gotten better once Logan was gone, and there was another woman who was chair of the department. They honored her in the 1970s a little bit, but by that time there is a bright side to the story. So when she retires, she gives millions of dollars to Western Michigan University and to Radcliffe because she was a smart investor. She was an inventor. She was a world-class bridge player. She was. So she does not fit. You know, this is the thing I can't work out. But that's why we need Barbara Savage. She does not fit the profile that was just like so easy to fit of, you know, black internationalist thought or in circuits, etc. She was like, you know, sorority folks, church. Stuff that I don't understand at all. But she was a zillionaire, and she refused to give any money to Howard. for what they had done to her, and the money went elsewhere. But it's all over. It's all over her papers, in Logan's papers, just in the negative. You know, bitch again. What is she doing to me? She's driving me crazy. You know, etc. I mean, it's pretty crazy, and it's been downplayed. Yeah, Logan has a biographer, and I wrote to him and said, hey, what about that stuff with Mers Tate? I said, why didn't you write about it? Logan's like cursing her out all the time. She's insane. He said, I thought better of it. I hinted at it. I didn't want to talk about it. But he said, I once went to Mers Tate's house and knocked on the door. And when I told her I was writing the biography of Rayford Logan, she slammed the door on me and wouldn't talk to me. So that seemed to me to go away. It lasted past it. Logan's life. Can I just say one more thing to this? There's an amazing project. I'm just riffing on the question by Patricia Owens and group at Sussex, because besides, I do talk about women in this book, but where are the women in international relations scholarship? The same problem exists, and there were a ton of them. Right. So if you think they don't exist, right, because if you think they don't exist because we don't cite them in the great, or they were not teaching, right? I think the first women get jobs in IR and major research universities in the 60s and 70s. Dina Zinnes, a couple of others before that. Well, but they were teaching for decades at women's colleges, and they were teaching international relations. But we've done no work. These guys are doing it. It's dozens of women who are really, really important to international relations thought, public policy in the world, but we're just learning about them. And what Owens has come up with a figure. She sort of says, so there are all these anthologies, the 100 greatest thinkers in international relations, or all the books that are written like for graduate students to absorb, like the field really quickly. She says, I believe there's an absolute upper limit to how many women can be mentioned, and it's 5. Okay, so if you've talked about 620 people or 100 people, it is only 5 women. So Hannah, we can cover the names. Hannah Arendt, there's like a few others in a way. But that is waiting to be explored and written about in a serious way.
Yeah, I'm a comparativist, and I'm interested in the politics of development. And my way of thinking about how studying development in the U.S. started was, after World War II, Truman looks at the world and says, how do I keep all these people from becoming communists? We need to fund comparative politics. But I'm interested in understanding more about the continuities between what you were talking about with scholars of colonial administration and modernization theorists and early people working in comparative politics, like Lipson and all that.
So you just told the origin of that. Development starts in 1949. What is that? Except with Fred Cooper says, or other people say, or whether you're a postmodernist or a positivist scholar, development starts in 1949 with point 4. But there's a 10 to 20 year prehistory where some of the ideas or practice are found in colonial reform projects in Great Britain in the 1930s and 40s. Many people say this stuff. Well, it's just not true. Because as I said, as we were talking, this is exactly what I talked about in Robert's class this morning. I said, well, the funny thing is, where did those 1920s and 30s precursors to development theory come from? The Tuskegee experiment. And Tuskegee experts go abroad and teach this stuff to the Brits, etc. So, the Journal of Race Development is the development journal, right. Though the Journal of Negro Education is about development as far as we understand. But here was the point. What does that story do? What is the effect of that story in 1949? It takes the United States out of the story of empire and imperialism. After all, in this story, the United States is the counter to the colonial powers who maybe they had some reforms on the edges, but we're really doing this thing beforehand, right? So we were never an empire. We were doing this, etc. It just so the other thing I said in the class was this has to be written up. you won't write it, you won't get a job. But in this, I mean, unless you're a historian, then you would get a super big job if you could tie this all together. But I said there's something called the Lake Mohawk conferences that started in the 1880s, right? Those conferences are where people like the folks starting the Journal of Race Development are getting their ideas. These were ideas about how to improve the lives of the Native Americans, basically, and the Universal Races Congress, etc., Tuskegee, and so forth, right? You know, all these are understood as the world of race development, with the understanding that what applies in Harlem or in the South also will apply in Africa or anywhere else, because after all, our units are these races, we understand how they work, you know, et cetera, and so forth. And so I wrote a review of Alden Morris's book where I talk about some of this in Perspectives on Politics, and you could get citations to it and how one might think about this. So that's, please.
This is a really great talk. Thank you very much. I teach half of my year at UVA, but the other half in the last 2 years in Hong Kong. And when you teach international relations theory, you always start off talking about all the great realism and liberalism ideas. But little differences in Asia. You have to start off by how did this come about? Americans started to dominate it, and some Americans dominated it, and what's wrong and what's good about it. And a lot of Asians treat it as a game anyway. And it's temporary because it just happened in a few decades. It's nothing compared to thousands of years of theory that the Chinese could have developed. So my question is this, for the bigger audience of the world, what could have the black international theorists have contributed to American policy? For example, you said Tate wrote about the Pacific expansion, for example, the Vietnam War or the Korean War. All of that interracial tension that we see in the United States now, young Chinese students of mine are talking about it all the time. What have the Americans not learned so that they bring this internationally? In your view, I think your book will give a lot of personal dynamic. What are their thoughts?
Well, there's a problem there, and that's the Cold War itself. Because virtually every one of those figures that I talk about, for one reason or another, convert to Cold War liberalism. So did Harold Isaacs. I mean, it's this massive phenomenon. I mean, and you know this might be a little bit of a cliche almost, or too simple, but the folks who study Cold War liberalism and black internationalism, you know, sort of say basically there's a trade-off. You stop talking about the international, and you are then under those in those circumstances able to support the rise of civil rights in the United States. So there's this kind of shift from a perspective that sort of says these are all connected, but in a kind of with the intellectuals I'm interested in with a progressive tint to it, right? So there are arguments where all these racism was this thing that keep us down, and of course we're just as good as anybody else, and freedom now is George Padmore's position, independence, and so forth. By the 1950s, that there's a tremendous disconnect, right? Black international. Well, if you're a black internationalist on the left, you're being arrested, right? So the Council on African Affairs is closed down, for instance. So who's the one person who remains true, or in some turns left, right? Du Bois joins the Communist Party. A bunch comes to detest Du Bois. He's invited to speak at a testimonial to Du Bois. He said, "Oh, nothing to do with him." Logan, Isaacs thought he was crazy because Isaacs escaped from communism, right, and Trotskyism, right, and came to embrace liberalism. And here was Du Bois in the 90s joining the Communist Party, and you could read, you could read one of the chapters in the book where he goes to see Du Bois and meets him and talks. It was the most, negative account I've ever seen of this, one-time smart guy who's a broken down, a disaster, right? So people convert en masse, roughly, to Cold War liberalism. And it takes if you want, the Black Power movement and the students in the 60s and 70s who are then starting to push internationalism again, right, and trying to make connections between the third world and the United States and so forth. And people like Bunch hated the student revolutionary movement. Logan, I'll tell you one story about Logan. There's no reason why you're going to know this because you don't do Afro-American history. Logan, unlike Tate, gave money to Howard for an endowed lectureship, but there was one condition on it. It could not be about black politics or by anyone who identifies as black. This was, and of course they violated that. You're looking like that's like crazy, because Logan said, we're not black, this is like this crazy idea, we're Negroes, we're all sorts of colors, we're not just, black. He just hated black politics and black identity. So much so, this is true too, though Skip Gates won't like it. So Skip Gates was trying to enlist him to join his project of, the Black Encyclopedia, right? And he was gonna fulfill Du Bois's dream. And Gates goes to Logan and said, will you join the board of this thing? Meanwhile, Gates is finding out there are these Ghanaian professors who are trying to create the encyclopedia. He just ignores them, he doesn't pay any attention. This is my project. He's a graduate student at the time. And he's telling Logan, will you join the board? And Logan says, yeah, but under one condition, you really should call it, the Negro Encyclopedia. He goes, oh no, you're absolutely right, Professor Logan, we're gonna do this, et cetera, et cetera. Just like basically, as far as I see, told Logan what he wanted to hear. But really this like kind of black identification of that movement, of that time, was anathema to a lot of the older scholars in a way, both white and black, for probably, multiple reasons in some sense. But I can't remember where we started with that. Oh, yeah.
Thanks so much for the talk. I'm really excited to read the book. So I teach in New Zealand, and a lot of my colleagues, and a lot of my colleagues did their PhDs in the UK, and I've noticed that sort of their training in international relations has much more of a critical bent than it seems like kind of the American discipline has. And I'm wondering, though, if you can tell a similar story about kind of silencing or repression of black voices or other voices in the context of the UK. And I know this is outside of the scope of this book, but I saw that Robbie Shilliam had reviewed your book, and he suggested that you can tell a similar story.
For sure you can, and folks are doing it. So there are now, I had nothing to do with it. People were doing it before me, during me, after me. But there are these revisionist histories coming out about early UK, all about if they were colonial administration, they were talking about racism, imperialism, and the Round Table, and so forth. South Africa, there's a historian of the early discipline in international relations who basically comes to the same conclusion about what South Africa, I said South Africa, sorry, Australia. There's a historian named Robert Cotton who writes about the field. The story is going to unfold in very predictable ways, right? In some sense, except for one thing. When IR turns its back on, if I put it this way, on racism, it just doesn't write about it anymore, and the fields get recarved up in some way. International relations in the UK is turning to research it. So the Royal Institute of International Affairs is funding this Institute of Race Relations. You might care about this because it ultimately creates the journal Race and Class, like later on in life. But it was like, we're going to fund this because they claim, this was their pitch to the Rockefeller Foundation, it was successful. People think communism is the threat that the Western world faces, but it's not true. It's race war that is the central question, and we need ways to counteract that. But can I just say something about England, because this is true. When you read Alice in Wonderland, you go through the Looking Glass, okay, you can go to departments in international relations in Sussex is where I'm thinking about, and it's insane. It's completely insane. It's like a different world. It's, you can either think it's like a utopia or a dystopia, because every one of them are critical, post-colonial, literary folks doing, et cetera, and, they're not critical development studies and so forth. Like, it's hard for me to stay there because I know I have to go back home in some sense where no one's looking at me. Or, someone else had their hand, right?
Well, I had my hand up, but I'm trying to remember. I have a bunch of questions that are sort of mushed together. But one of the things I was thinking about in your response to Greta is that I've been trying to sort through is to what extent the flight from racism, the move away from thinking about race and race relations and imperialism, it also seems to be a move away from history. So one of the things that's interesting about this period is the kind of Dunning School understanding of, the sort of racist histories of the United States. Those are still thriving in, so the kind of racist narratives that, race and racism seems to be both, to go underground in this story. But my sense is that within, and John, you can correct me if I'm wrong, that in the field of history, you don't have a similar move. And I think I'm interested because so many of these figures are kind of on that cusp of, they're writing histories and they're writing, in the social sciences in various ways. Does that make sense?
It makes sense. I don't know that I could solve that problem for you because, again, I took the easy way out. It's just not there in international relations. I cannot tell you instead, how do we think about C. Van Woodward, et cetera. But I would say this, right? I would use not Soule's at this point, but Du Bois's Black Reconstruction as a measure. When does that start to get read and cited again? We know this. Barrington Moore wrote, right, his famous treatise that we're all going to teach, The Origins of, whatever it's called, because you're still reading next. What is it? The Origins of Dictatorship and Democracy. He wrote a whole, section on the Civil War. Black Reconstruction is not cited in that book. So when does it come back? Again, I think something happens in the 70s, and with the Black Power movement that shifts. So yes, C. Van Woodward is writing. There are people I guess you would see him as a critic of the Dunning School. Would that be roughly correct? Right? Correct. Yeah.
I guess part of what I'm asking is
Race
whether
comes in, class goes out.
Excuse me?
Race comes in, class goes out.
But there's an interesting way in which there's a difference, I think, between silence on the one hand and the ways in which certain kinds of racist narratives are still perpetuated and talked about on the other, whether critically or...
We can talk about, it's the Murdalian moment too, in some sense, right? Yeah, and again, Murdal, we're going to fulfill the United States. Our best intentions are being undermined by these guys in the South. We're gonna get better. America can redeem itself, right? But no one ever quotes this part from Murdal. Go to the end of the book. What happens if we don't? Blacks are going to rise up and revolt and destroy the whites. Right, so he sees that because race war is everywhere in the New York Times as well. In even Schelling's treatise on not asymmetrical games. Race war is one of the phenomena that could be studied under using this method, etc. So people are talking about this. I was amazed how much it was there, just not in the scholarship, right? Or the scholarship where it would be something else starting to be called, sociology, basically, black politics in the 70s and 80s, but just gone from this particular, corner, which was concerned with, atomic weapons, defense, security issues, et cetera, and then interdependence. So Cohen, introduces the concept complex interdependence, and you all have to study it. That's in Raymond Leslie Buell's textbook from 1923. He talks about complex interdependence as the state of the world today.
So, I have a set of thoughts. I'm wondering if you can react to. It seems I was struck early in the talk about the sort of parallel between the birth, or at least the ideas around American exceptionalism and like IR exceptionalism, with this founding myth of a few Greek roots and then an immaculate conception in the middle of the century. And the way that involved, a retreat from, thinking about race and from maybe sociological theorizing more generally, and certain ways of understanding and thinking about power. And so I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts kind of at that more abstract level about, and as we are, the power, violence, inequality collective. interested in, kind of the dropping out of ways of understanding power as something other than, two actors who are, getting each other to do that which they wouldn't otherwise do in a kind of open, forceful way. And anyway,
Okay.
Yeah.
I would say this. So this book is not a book of theory, right? And I disappoint people who actually care about what these guys really thought, because they don't do it in sustained ways, etc. I like these stories a lot more, as you can see. But if you argue, what do you need to take from the Howard School today? Would be the recurrent or a constant emphasis on the reality of hierarchy in international relations. Now, Anthony Lake says, no problem, I've now worked out that hierarchy is true in international relations. So, right, I mean, it's a recent discovery of international relations that hierarchy does exist and that we're going to study it in the ways that we can. But think about all the ways that hierarchy has to be hidden in post-war international relations until this day. The liberals do it and the realists do it themselves in a way, and we could think about ways that do it. But here's the way. The one that you trained as undergraduates, when you do the Millian dialogue, the strong do what they will, the weak do what they must. The first time that appeared in IR journal, IR publication, in 1917 or 1921. You can see it in the book by Leonard Woolf. Leonard Woolf analyzes the Millian dialogue. So you know him, he's Virginia Woolf's husband. He kind of thought about international relations and empire and stuff, and he says, what does the Millian dialogue illustrate? For us today, it illustrates the reality of power, right? Right? Power is everything. If you don't have the power, Woolf says, if you read the whole dialogue, what you see is it's about hierarchy, right? Once, norms apply, this is roughly it, norms and rules apply to one set of states or places, right? Force applies to relations with another set of states. So don't, you remember the dialogue, don't bother us with norms, or like we're doing X or Y. Then the strong do what they will, the weak do what they must, right? So it's a hierarchy that's erased time and time again, it seems to me, in the course of international relations reformulation. So the one I like to think about the best most these days is Eikenberry. God bless his soul, right? Liberal Leviathan, whatever those books are. Right? Remember how the U.S. is not an empire, or if it's an empire, it's the most benevolent empire ever. It works through rules, etc. Well, it does if what you're looking at are those sets of 6 or 7 or 8 states, right? That he conflates, or I don't know if I got the term right? He calls it the world. But it's really the set of relations among a small set of states. And then he's called on this so many times that he has little footnotes. Okay, we might have been a little imperialistic in certain places, use some power here, but they're not, but the theory still holds. And that's an argument that shows you how the hierarchy gets erased, right? And I came in as an undergraduate. Right, I trained in. It doesn't really matter what I do. I remember coming into consciousness as a political person and as a scholar, Vietnam War era, etc., around questions of empire. I always thought imperialism was the way to think about things, right? But the discipline has been committed time and time again to saying no to that, or that's something that's happened somewhere else, not here, or in other ways, kind of avoiding that. So it's the hierarchy part that I think is really central, a central feature of their study. These empires, these forms of expansionism, these kind of rules for one set of folks as opposed to other really, really matter. And why those must be overcome in some sense. Sorry, I'm looking at you when you asked the question. Okay? There's a riff. I mean, sorry.
It's fascinating. And it makes, as an American politics scholar, it makes me want to go reread Myrtle and B.O. Key, who's father of public opinion research and studying government politics. But that's my diversion.
Or better yet, go read their papers.
Yeah.
It's a lot of fun.
All right. Well, we're about at time, so let's.
Thanks so much. I appreciate it.